Next from Chicago, lawmakers talk about the growing cost of state pensions and how that is making it increasingly difficult for the legislature to fund other services and to maintain quality education. This runs about 1 hour and 10 minutes.
Thank you for coming. This is, of course, a session on pension reform and what they're looking at in Springfield and the Capitol as far as the state pension systems go. And really what we're trying to do is give you an idea of not only the merits of proposals, but of the process that has been going on in Springfield. So I'll try to set that stage a little bit. My name is Ben Schwarm. I'm Deputy Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Boards. We tried to compile a group of panelists here who can cover all the angles. I think we have done that. We have a couple of changes. I believe when this went out earlier, it said Mr. Jerry Sturmer would be here from the governor's office. Instead, we have a very able replacement, Mr. Hans Zygmunt, who is the Associate Director and Economist for Governor Quinn's Office of Management and Budget, and has been very involved in all the discussions and processes of the current pension reform discussions. Also, originally it said Senator Bill Brady would be here. He called yesterday, said he could not make it, and again, very ably replaced today by Senator Sue Rezin, who is from Morris, represents the LaSalle, Peru area in the Illinois State Senate. And then, of course, correctly mentioned in your programs, Representative Elaine Nekritz, who is here. She's from the Northbrook area, serves in the Illinois House of Representatives, has been really the key person on the pension reform discussions. And Dr. Brent Clark, who's the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, who has also been very involved over the last year or two on this issue. So those are the panelists we're bringing for you. We tried to give you all those perspectives. Everyone will have a chance to make their comments, say a few words, and we will make sure that we have time for questions later on before we adjourn today. I want to give a very brief overview of at least in my mind, where this started. I will, of course, be accused again of being very overly generalizing the issue, but I do that to kind of set the stage. Generally, it's a fiscal problem. It's a budget problem for the state. And about 2 or 3 years ago, really when the budget crisis hit, people in the Capitol, legislators, economists, other types of people who were involved in the issue generally identified 2 drivers of the state budget deficit. One was health care cost, namely Medicaid, and the second was the cost annually to the state's 5 pension systems. And what they looked at was over time, not only was there a deficit currently, but over time, it was going to be really difficult with those 2 things driving higher costs to the state budget. It would be very difficult to balance the state budget, not only currently, but in future years. So those are the 2 targets they really set their eyes on. So then 2 years ago, they looked at the issue. Obviously, there are a couple of things that come into play when you look at pensions and pension benefits. One, there is a fairness issue. We have employees who are working, who have been promised certain pension benefits, and we have a state constitution which guarantees those state benefits, so those pension benefits. So that was a big consideration when you looked at this. So 2 years ago, the first thing they did was say, okay, we're going to look at pensions, we're going to look at benefits, we're going to try to save money. We can't diminish the pension benefits of current employees. So they did pass legislation which started what they call Tier 2, which is a new set of pension benefits for, in our case, remember the Teachers Retirement System, TRS, for anybody who started work in a school district on January 1, 2010, or 2011, or beyond. Different set of benefits. Doesn't cost as much money. They're trying to save money, right? And indeed, most people thought this will save money in about 30 years when these people retire. So then it was a little different target, and they started looking at what can we do on the pension benefits for current employees, and that's where things got a little sticky. That's what we'll try to discuss today. So with no further ado, we will start the afternoon and let our experts fill you in with the details, and we'll first start with Dr. Clark.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I had no idea when Ben called me to talk about school bus bidding that there'd be this many people interested in it, but here we are. So I'll open with this, and when you're done, you'll probably agree with this one statement. If this was easy, it would have already been done. We've been wrestling with this for a number of years. It's a very complex problem. It's a complex issue. It has tentacles. It goes in a variety of directions and affects people and affects systems, affects employment, affects tax rates, affects livelihoods. It's emotional, it's personal, and it's a big deal. And that's why there's so many of you in this room today to talk about pension reform. Not that you're wanting to be reformed, but you're wanting to know what's going to happen to you and how it's going to impact your life. This goes back, as Ben started to lay out, really in earnest since beginning about in spring of 2011. And we got into through that session, and by the time we got to the summer, we were holding some, I think, some pretty heavy and substantial conversations here at the State of Illinois' Blandick building, just a few blocks away. We were meeting once to twice a week, and we're going through the nuts and bolts and the understanding of how pension systems were really built, and how they were wired, and how they were supposed to work. And as we came out of the summer and the fall of 2011, and we came into the spring of 12, then things began to take a much faster speed. And in mid-February 2012, you saw this working group that Representative Neckers was on, Senator Resin sitting in for Senator Brady, who was on that working group. But there was representation from all the caucuses in both chambers. The governor's office had representation, and then the various groups that were affected across the state were all called in one by one to talk about what the pension reform may in fact entail, how it affected the members, what the tentacles of that would be, what our interests were, and from there it built momentum and excitement, if you will, as we headed toward the scheduled adjournment in the end of May. By the time we reached the first part of May, we began to enter a much more rapid-fire schedule of negotiations, and it became to the point where it was daily. You were negotiating with the idea of trying to come to some resolution on the entire bundle of issues inside pension reform. So as we got into the final days, we were literally walking in as the teachers were coming out, and then as the unions were, or the university people were just leaving. So it was a constant swinging door for those that were really, Representative Neckers, you were there probably most days all day, but she sat through all the meetings, but we were part of those groups that would go in and bargained those different elements. So you're saying, what were the key elements that you felt were important? And here's how we framed it up. This was our general framework of key elements that we believed were important to resolve this issue. Number one was the state guarantee. And the state guarantee was supposed to go at the idea that we all admit and had discovered that a large portion of the problem had come from over time, the state not making their payments either in full or skipping a payment, and creating this backlog, if you will, of unfunded liabilities within the pension system. So we believe that admitting that, recognizing that, and making a commitment to not let that happen in the future, so we call that the state guarantee, was the absolute essential piece to resolving this going forward, because we didn't want to repeat this instance or this problem 30 or 40 years down the road. Number two was any benefits that were going to be affected by the membership or for members, those effects or those reductions had to be constitutional in nature. In other words, we have pretty strong constitutional protections in Illinois. Any changes to that had to fall within the confines of the Constitution. Number three, we believe that the debt payment schedule that's on track now through 2045 honestly should be restructured. It's a payment schedule set by statute, and we believe it could be changed by statute to restructure that where it's more manageable over time. The fourth piece was the cost shift, and that's what got everybody's attention, because that you started to think about, now how are we going to pay for that? If that cost gets shifted to the districts, How are we going to come up with the money in districts that are already struggling, are already running deficit budgets, they're burning through reserves? Where do we get the money to pay for a cost shift? So the things we looked at was, one, is how about a cap? How about a cap on the amount that gets shifted to the district? Because that would you would at least be able to know what your overall exposure is over time, and your exposure shouldn't exceed whatever that cap number was. Number two is we looked at what about a levy, and a levy outside of the cap, which is a big deal because tax caps, as you know, are in a number of counties in Illinois. Many of you in the room may have tax caps. But having a levy to go get this money, maybe in conjunction with the IMRF levy, was an idea that was put on the table. The third part of the cost shift was this. What about mandate relief? What about all the mandates that get sent to school districts to carry out with no money to carry them out? What about those mandates that exceed the federal mandate level? You know, there's a lot of dollars that are tied up in that. What about rolling those back to just the state level to give school districts flexibility with money to apply toward this pension cost shift? And then we're also open to any other magical solution that they might want to come up with to give a financial relief to pay for this cost shift. So that was the general framework that we arrived with at the front door and we stayed with throughout the entire negotiation. And as we headed toward those final days in May, as I said earlier, I literally have my lovely and sophisticated yellow notepads. And it's a good thing that we ran out of session days because I was down to one more sheet. And we didn't really have any more days to go, see, so it was perfect timing on my yellow sheets. Good thing they don't make any more of these, or we would have, you know, maybe been in there all summer. But as of 5 o'clock, it's not that serious, guys, lighten up. Come on. On May the 30th, at 4 o'clock, that's what my notes say here, here's where we were. And why do I tell you that today? Because pretty much, this is still the deal that's on the table. Okay, so here's the deal that was on the table at 4 o'clock on May the 30th, and we believe it's still probably the framework of the deal that's on the table as we'll head back into veto session and the early session in January. So here it was. Everyone's heard about the choice provision. So for the employees, there was this choice provision that you had to choose A or B, and here's how the choices worked out. And why was this important? Well, it was believed that this went a long way toward meeting the constitutional requirement of an acceptance, or an offer and an acceptance in a contractual capacity. So this was believed by those that framed this, that this would meet the constitutional challenge that was sure to come. So under choice A, for the purposes of salary calculations and pensions, you would no longer be able to count future salary increases. So if you pick choice A, this framework, any future salary increases would not be allowed to count toward pensionable earnings. Number two, you would also forego and give up forever the compounded COLA provision that comes with the benefits package, and you would end up with what we call a Tier 2 COLA, which was half a CPI or 3%, whichever is the lesser. Okay? The third part was, if you gave that up, then you also would have access to health care as a retiree. You would have access to what's called a cash balance plan that will come into play just a little bit later. And number three, you would have access personally and individually to ERO throughout your career. Choice B was this. I said that wrong earlier. When I said that you would give up salary increases, that's wrong. You would keep salary increases if you kept that lower COLA, okay? So let me retract. Choice A, you keep all salary increases for the purposes of calculating pensions, and then you give up the COLA. So you give that up to a Tier 2 COLA. Choice B is you give up those future salary increases, but you keep the compounded COLA. Okay, so I had those reversed, but that's how it really is. Give up the future salary increases and keep the compounded COLA. Also, if you take that choice, there's no access to retiree health care, no access to the cash balance plan, and no access to the ERO. Then there's this third part that came in at the very bottom, and it was called Tier 3. And that was going to be for all new employees after a given date in the future. Tier 3 would have been a modified or a fancy 401k plan. It would have had a floor and a ceiling in terms of what the package would have earned on behalf of the employee. And the employer's responsibility would have been a 3% contribution into the cash balance plan. So over time, over a person's career, as they worked under Tier 3, the Tier 3 umbrella, the employer would put in 3%, the employee put in, I think, up to 6%, and then over time it would earn no less than 4%, no more than 10% over their career. When they retired, they would be given that bucket of money just like a 401k, and that would be their retirement plan. So it would really become, in a lot of ways, kind of a defined contribution plan for Tier 3 employees in the future, yet to be hired in any district. Okay? Then, the ERO, which is a big cost factor for districts, would have changed in how it's paid for. As you know now, districts have the lion's share of responsibility paying for the ERO cost. Well, in the future, under this proposal, it would have been split 50-50 between the employer and the employee. So that if you were the employee selecting to take ERO, you really had to want to take ERO because you're going to have to put big money up to take it, just like your employer would have to put big money up to take it. Element 3, the state guarantee that I talked about earlier as part of our general framework. This was still a concern to us because we didn't feel like it under this framework we had enough hard language that would hold the state's feet to the fire to make those payments in full, on time, every year going forward. What we wanted was language that was akin to bond indebtedness language, so that when the state came into each fiscal year and they had a requirement to pay their bonded debt, the next thing they had a requirement to pay was the pension payment. That's the language that we wanted to see. And that was still a question as to whether it was really clear in this deal. But what they had given us was a right to sue. And I'll let Representative Necritz talk about that in great detail, or more detail than I will. But there was a right to sue to help force the state to make those payments if, in fact, the state hadn't done that. Then there was a state actuary that would consult with the legislature as well as the pension systems, and they would develop a 30-year actuarially required contribution payment schedule, which we thought was pretty good. That would tell the General Assembly these are the payments that have to be made this year in order to keep the system solvent, which was a goal, solvent over time. The fifth element, and you're thinking complicated. I told you earlier if this was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. The fifth element was the cost shift, which was at that moment, at 4 o'clock on the 30th of May, was like this. There was a 17-year ramp of which the cost would have been shifted from the state to the districts. And it would have worked like this. There would have been 0% this year, 12-13, and then the next 10 years, it would have shifted at a rate of 0.6% per year. So at 11 years from now, we would have been up to 6% of payroll being paid toward the pensions. And then, if the employer normal cost was still rising at that point, at 11 years out, above 6%, then the districts would be taking on 0.5% a year until such time that you caught up and overtook the entire amount of the employer normal cost. Now Hans, when he gets up here, he'll be able to talk to you a little bit about how those employer normal costs were going to arc up and then begin to gradually slope down toward 3% over the next 35 years, so that eventually, 35 years from now, and I won't be here 35 years from now, promise, but 35 years from now, your employer normal costs would have gradually gone down to 3%, all because of the cash balance plan and Tier 3 employees. Okay? So that's how it would have drug it out over time. There was also an inseverability portion, which was really important, so that if any portion of this was struck down, the rest of it went down with it. So it was all banded together as one great big ugly package that everybody was like shaking their head, but you know, it all stuck together. And then the election period, and this is the last piece, the election period would have taken place this coming January through the end of May. So there would have been about a 5-month election period where people would have gone back and said, okay, do I want to take choice A or choice B? Do I want to keep a COLA, a compounded COLA, or do I want to keep future salary increases and have a lower COLA? Do I want to have access to retiree health insurance, or do I want to give that up? Do I want to have access to ERO, or do I give that? So there would have been about a 5-month election period for employees to figure out which choice was their best provision. So I'll end where I started. If this was easy, they'd have done it 5 years ago, because it needed done then. But it's something that's important to our state. Pension funding and school funding are very connected. And as you know, state aid has been declining for the last couple of years, and it's paramount that we get this resolved and get this behind us as a state and as organizations representing school people and school districts, so that we can move on and do the right things for kids. Okay, Ben?
The session is being taped by the Illinois channel. So if you see a camera in the back, that's what that is. So now we will move on with Representative Neckrist.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here with the folks that I spent my life with in the spring. Again, good to see everybody, and I appreciate the opportunity to hopefully give you a little bit more detail on a lot of the things that Brent talked about. And I don't want to overwhelm you with detail, but some of that detail I think is important to understanding the nature of the package and why we were proposing what we were proposing. It has been my pleasure to chair, sort of my pleasure, I guess, to chair the House Personnel and Pensions Committee for the last year. The previous chair resigned in the middle of his term, and I was elevated from the vice chair to the chair. And I apologize if I've said this to you before, but you know, it used to be that the Personnel and Pensions Committee was a great big committee because we got to give away a lot of goodies. We made friends, you know, people liked what we did. No more. This is a very small committee. No one really wants to be on this committee anymore unless you're really, unless you're really committed to the cause. So it is a very small committee, and frankly, a number of the members that were on the House Personnel and Pensions Committee this year are not going to be on it next year. One to the Senate, one retired. So we're going to have to find some new folks that are willing to step up and engage in the kind of very difficult negotiations and discussions that have been going on for quite some time. There's nothing about this that is fair, to use Brent's word. We made promises, and unfortunately we are now having to look people in the eye and say, I cannot keep those promises that I made to you. But the fact is that we cannot. Just in the last 2 years, the current fiscal year and what we're looking at for the next fiscal year, in this fiscal year the pension payment went up about $900 million. Our entire new revenues for this current fiscal year are in the neighborhood of $750 million. So when you see your school funding impacted in a negative way, in large measure that is being driven by the pension payment. We anticipate for next year that the situation will be very similar. The pension payment will go up somewhere in the neighborhood of an $800 million to $1 billion, and our entire new revenues will be about $1 billion. So the picture is much brighter over the next little bit. And in terms of the pension payments, and that's why this really has to be addressed. And people say to me, well, you know, the General Assembly is never going to do that. I'm like, well, no, the General Assembly will. I don't know when, but the General Assembly will because we have to. This is just an unsustainable trajectory, and the size of our general revenue budget is in the just over $34 billion. So to have the pension payment increasing $1 billion a year, really not affordable, really not sustainable. I want to talk a little bit about the constitutional structure as to why this particular proposal is set up that way. We do have the constitutional protection for that we cannot impair or diminish benefits for our public employees. What there is no constitutional protection for is future salary increases and for health care. And I think we all pretty much agree that's the structure that we have, the legal structure in the state of Illinois. So when we talk about the choice, what we're trying to do is say, okay, you may have a constitutional guarantee and a contract right over here to those benefits that you've earned, but over here there are things that we're giving you that we don't have to. And the General Assembly could say tomorrow, you know what, that health insurance that you're getting when you're retired, we're taking that away. But we will say, we will enter into that contract with you and give you a contract right to that health care benefit if you'll agree to a lower COLA. So that's the legal structure that we've set up. It's a contract structure. I don't think any other state has done it. And it might, I think it will be, you know, we'll see what the Supreme Court does with it, because I don't think there's any question but what we will end up with a lawsuit when we're all done with this. And we'll see what the Supreme Court does. But it scares me a little bit when I'm looking at this, because in states around the country that have done some pension reform for current employees, the courts are not responding very friendly to that. So, so we need to be very careful about how we set up the constitutional structure. I thought Brent did a nice job of describing the benefits, so I'm not gonna go into that. There are other options on the table that did not end up in this proposal, and that was in large measure as a result of the negotiations. You know, could we raise retirement age? Could we, increase employee contributions? You know, there's other levers we have to pull in order to impact the benefit package for current employees and current retirees. But through the negotiation, the structure we came up with was as Brent described it. The funding guarantee is another sort of constitutional challenge that we face, because what General Assemblies can do, they can undo in the future. So it's constitutionally impossible for us to bind ourselves in the future without a constitutional guarantee. So when we're looking for that ironclad guarantee that the General Assembly will do, will fund, and will do what it's supposed to do, it's really, I don't know how we do that. But we did set up in the legislation that's the proposal that's out there now, at a new right of action, at least for these systems, the pension systems, TRS and those, to be able to at least try to enforce the payment from the General Assembly in court. And up until now, the courts have said there is no funding guarantee, and you, as the person trying to make sure that the system is funded, will have to go away, because we're not going to enforce that. So this would be a pretty significant step forward, I think, in terms of a funding guarantee, of giving someone a right to go after the General Assembly on that. I'd just like to talk for a minute about the cost shift, because I know that for school districts that's a very controversial item. It's my view that we have a lot of situations in government everywhere where we have cases of, we are where we are because of the historical circumstance of it, and that's where we are in terms of the difference between how the city of Chicago funds its pensions, where it is part of their property tax bill that those property taxpayers then pay the pensions for the Chicago teachers' pension fund, and Chicago and suburban and downstate teachers come solely from sales and income taxes and general revenue funds, and so Chicago taxpayers end up paying twice, both through their property taxes and through their sales and income taxes. We have a lot of those historical accidents. I don't sense that if we tried to correct every one of those, it's in Illinois state law, we'd be at it for forever. For me, this is about aligning the incentive to make sure that those that are setting wages and salaries are taking account of the full cost of that. And we've had that disconnect for quite some time. It's had a significant impact on the funding level of the pension system. So aligning those incentives is important, which is why I'm very flexible on how we do that, what time frame we do to that. And are there other ways we can ameliorate some of the impact of that by doing the mandate relief, by doing some other things. I think that's a very open discussion we can have, but I do believe that, again, aligning that incentive is important. One of the other things I hear is, well, if you're gonna impose this cost on the school boards or on the school districts, then let us set benefits. And in fact, I think that's what and it will take a very long time, I agree, but that's what the Tier 3, this cash balance plan, does allow school boards the flexibility to say, we're gonna, the employee will put in this amount, but we're gonna put in X, Y, Z, whatever we as a school board determine. And so over the long run, and it will be decades, I get that, but over the long run, it will be up to the district, the boards themselves, to determine how much they're going to be contributing toward their employees' pension costs. We go back into session on November 27th, and we will have a 2-week session then. I really don't anticipate we will be addressing this issue at that point. It seems that everyone has said, nah, I'm not going to do it then. But then we have our lame duck session, right, which is right before the new General Assembly is seated on, I think it's January 9th. And I recognize, I'm the only person around, I think, that's saying this. I don't know that we will do it even then, even though I know the governor's pushing and others may be pushing, and I could be, I've been wrong plenty of times when I've been trying to predict what will happen in Illinois. But legislatures, and it's not just the Illinois General Assembly, legislatures everywhere respond to time deadlines. We respond to the pressure to get something done. And really the next time pressure we have is June 30th, because the pension systems themselves, the teachers' retirement systems, state university retirement system, really cannot implement any of this in the middle of a fiscal year, and our fiscal year is a July 1 fiscal year. So it's my belief that time pressure will not really start to build until the end of session in May. So we'll see. We'll see what happens in the lame duck, and I can come back hopefully next year, and so you can all tell me I was wrong in terms of my prediction on the time frame. But I do believe that is the next time frame we face. I don't mean to minimize the importance of the state's bond rating when I say that. And if the rating agencies all of a sudden, and Hans will know more than I will about this, but the rating agencies suddenly say, you know what, Illinois General Assembly, we're going to lower your bond rating tomorrow unless you do pension reform today. Okay, that's the kind of deadline and that's the kind of pressure that we do respond to as well. So that could come into play. Just want to leave you with some larger perspective on all this. The National Conference of State Legislatures is a national organization, obviously, that brings together legislators on a number of issues, all kinds of issues, and really is a voice for states and legislatures across the country. I was just on a conference call yesterday where they have formed a pension task force to look at what are states doing, how are they addressing these problems across the nation. Because while we may be the lowest funded in the nation, which we are, and we may be facing a deeper crisis than anyone else, we are not alone in this. Every state is facing this. And it was interesting, I was listening to a state senator from Alaska who was saying that their pension payment is about a third of their general revenue fund. So they're about got a third going to Medicaid, a third going to education, a third going to pensions. And I thought, wow, well, we're not so out of a lot. I mean, that's about we're not quite there yet in terms of the level of our pension payment. So while we have a dire situation, we have to get this addressed. We're not the only state in the nation that is facing this crisis, and other states are looking at it as well. And we're going to school on them and trying to figure out what they're doing, what best practices are, and what's working in other locations. So just keep that in mind when you read the Chicago Tribune.
Thank you, Representative. Hearing Representative Neckrits and Dr. Clark, when they both mentioned the state guarantee and how we got into the problem, and it kind of makes me think of any other compulsive behavior. Step one, admit you have a problem. So it sounds to me like we may have 11 steps to go, but I think at least they have it. We see the problem.
And this was a very good intro, Ben, in regards to we have to realize that we have a problem. I've been in the Senate for the last 2 years, actually. My district is the 38th district. It's considered a rural district. And I started about 1.5 years ago, everywhere I went with town halls, having a budget talk. I think it's important to understand where we are and how we got here before you can understand why we're making the decisions that we're making, because these are not easy decisions in Springfield. For the last many years, we've just had a budget that has been increasing. As a result of that, we've been borrowing money to pay for it. Our borrowing has quadrupled in the last 10 years, so for every dollar of revenue we're taking in, we were borrowing $4. We also passed a large income tax increase, and that went for our pension payment last year. Next year, that won't be enough money. We also, as a result, have a program. If we did not reform our Medicaid, if you want to really look at getting your budget in line, the two fastest growing pieces of our budget are the Medicaid and pensions. Our Medicaid was set to increase this year, from this year to next year, almost $2.7 billion. So as a result, and this isn't a budget that's really not increasing. As a result, we did go through some very massive, very large Medicaid reform. It's very difficult to do. To go in and say, hey, you know what, we can't afford all of these benefits, but it's something that we needed to do in order to stabilize our budget. Our pensions, as Representative Neckrits said, from this year to next year alone will increase almost $1 billion in a budget that's really not increasing too much. And as a result, the credit rating agencies, which I view as very kind of political, they're out here looking at us saying, you know what, state of Illinois, you need to get a plan in place. In the last 10 years, our credit rating has been downgraded 13 times. pensions. To put that in the perspective, in the history of the state, we've been downgraded 19 times. If you read the analysis of the credit rating agencies, you know, the red flags that they keep raising is you need to go through and address your pensions. You need to reform your pensions. So when you start to see all of this, and all of these red flags going up, then we come to the conclusion we have to make very difficult decisions. And that's what we're doing in Springfield. And I've talked about that for a year and a half in my district. My district we have many state employees, many teachers, community colleges, and I've been up front with them from the very beginning. Not all agree with me, but they at least appreciate that we're being very honest and we're having an honest discussion. Because to do nothing in the state that's not even an option anymore. That option's not on the table. So as a result, we came into the Senate. The governor, he put together a working group for pensions. Representative Nekritz is the lead, as you know, on the speaker's side. Senator Brady is the representative. All 4 caucuses are in there. So Senator Brady is our representative, and Senator Nolan and Representative Singer, thank you. But also, it's important to know who's in this room. We have actuarials in this room. We have constitutional attorneys in this room. We have all of the chiefs of staff from the governor's office, Hans, the economist from the governor's office, at the table. We've had all the associations sit at the table and tell us what will work for them and what won't work for the people they represent. We've had the union sit at the table telling us what will work for their association and what won't. This is a good conversation at the table. There are certain things, because at the end of the day, we have to go back and talk to our constituents, our caucus, or whoever, and say this is a good deal because of. And for our particular caucus, the Senate Republican caucus, which it's no secret that we have said we will help with pension reform. We believe it's that important to the state. We need to stabilize it. We do have a problem with the cost shift and what it means to our school districts, and we'll talk about that because I'm sure you'll have many questions later on regarding that. But it's a difficult decision, but we need to do it. So we have a very good discussion table about what can work and what just really won't work with the people that are represented at the table. And from that, I think you have seen the framework for pension reforms. We're going to have some tweaks in there, but for the most part, the 2 biggest drivers of the unfunded liability of the pensions are, first, the COLA. We have a compound COLA. Not many people, if any, states offer a compound COLA. And that changed. We used to offer, and most people don't realize this, we used to offer a 3% simple COLA in the 90s, which changed to a compound COLA. That is probably the biggest driver, other than missing payments or underfunding payments, to our unfunded liability. So that's why you're seeing the major emphasis talking about this cost of living adjustment. The second major component of our unfunded liability is really underfunding or missing pension payments. We cannot miss pension payments from this point forward. And I do agree with everyone up here that we need language strong enough to ensure that we do not miss or underfund pension payments from this point forward. It's like you missing your mortgage on your home and never making up the principal for years. You just cannot do it. So we've had that discussion. There is agreement on the table with that. The discussion or the concern with our caucus is in the cost shift, but I know working with Representative Nekritz, we'll see, we'll try to work through that and see if there's an option out there that works with everybody. But in regards to the rest of the details of the pension reform, I think for the most part we've had a very good, productive working group. So I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. One of the other problems that make this so complicated, not only the nuts and bolts that Dr. Clark, Representative Nekritz talked about, but how complex it is. It's a political problem. You have legislators, Republicans, Democrats. There are 5 different state systems we're talking about. Obviously here today, mostly about the one for the teachers. There's one for state employees, there's one for university employees, there's one for members of the General Assembly, there's one for the judges. You have a management perspective, generally where Dr. Clark and I were in those meetings with school management. On the other side, you have all the unions involved. with a totally different perspective. And then you have other groups, business groups, Civic Federation of Chicago, others who have joined in the fray, and it's not a two-sided issue. It's multi-sided, and that's what really makes it so complicated. So what we're going to do now is give you perfect clarity on everything and all the numbers. We have Mr. Hans Zygmunt here. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Ben and the association for allowing me to speak. Of course, Mr. Sturmer sends his regards. Hopefully I'll be adequate in his replacement. I'd like to begin by, I'll rehash some of what's already been said and provide some broader budgetary but also economic context to this discussion. I think that everyone in this room recognizes that the state of Illinois is facing extraordinary financial and budgetary pressures. You've all seen that. There is probably, if I asked who is missing money from the state, every hand in this room goes up. And yet, there's no silver bullet, there's no magic pot of money that we can go to find the funds to then distribute and make everybody happy. So as the Senator pointed out, of course, this is going to mean very, very difficult choices, difficult choices that have to be made by your elected officials. Now the pressures that are being brought upon them are not just being brought upon them by pension corps. We have the rising cost of health care. I remember not too many years ago I was an economist for a trade association, and there was all kinds of various economic factors that I would discuss at these meetings and that were of various interest to people. One of the things I put up on the board, and this was in the middle 2000s, was a forecast of rising healthcare costs and showing that by, I think it was 2010 was the outlier of the forecast date, and I said that the cost of healthcare is going to take up 19% of the United States economy by 2010. Of course, I was right, and it didn't take a genius to figure that out. I mean, it was a simple, a very simple statistical analysis. And of course, it's an increasing problem for a lot of reasons. And in Illinois, we're facing this on the Medicaid side, but we're also facing this because we have an increasingly older population within the state of Illinois. And so our Department of Aging is facing significant pressure. Of course, also facing this on the employee group health side. Some would say that our current budget for this fiscal year under-appropriates group health by $600 million. Now, these are extraordinary budget pressures. On the Medicaid side, we've taken measures on both service reductions and reducing reimbursements. We increased the cigarette tax by $1. It's going to raise $350 million a year. Through the federal matching process, we get another $350 million. That'll provide $700 million that we're going to use to pay Medicaid, plus the $2 billion in reductions. That's the $2.7 billion that the senator was referring to, but that just keeps our head above water. That's, I mean, some people would say that's not even a cut. That's just holding constant. And so we face extraordinary pressures on the spending side. Now, I also want to acknowledge up front that we don't believe that the pension crisis that we're all in this room for is the fault of the school boards. It's not the fault of the teachers. It's not the fault of state employees. It's not the fault of university professors. The single reason that we are in this room talking is because the state of Illinois failed on an annual basis to make the actuarially required contribution to the pensions. And it has never done so without borrowing in the history of these funds. Now,
that's a big statement.
It is. It's a huge statement. And some people will say, well, we made the ARC payment in 2003, yeah, and you borrowed $10 billion to do it. Congratulations. You know? So, moving forward. In fiscal 13, 15% of our general funds budget, $5.1 billion, will go to the 5 state pension funds. Next year, according to my math, and I think it's pretty good, $6.186 billion. $6.186 billion. That's 17.5% of the general fund's budget, okay, going to the state pensions. It's over $1 billion increase year to year. Now yesterday, we had a revenue committee hearing over at the Blandick building. And the Department of Revenue testified that for fiscal year 14, we expect state source or state tax revenues to increase between $600 million and $700 million. $1 billion increase in the pension payment. I'm already $300 million behind the game. Okay. Now, there are some problems with that $600 to $700 million increase that we are expecting. And part of those problems reside in Washington, D.C. because we are facing a potential fiscal cliff that could wipe out every single dollar we expect to gain in additional tax revenues in fiscal year 14. The economists at the state of Illinois, myself, I work with the economists at the Department of Revenue. We talk with Moody's Analytics, IHS Global Insight, and their economists to come up with a sort of consensus view on what we think is going to happen. And if this fiscal cliff, if we go over the fiscal cliff, we're expecting about a 5 percentage point reduction in economic growth, which would equate to about a 2.5% economic contraction. In other words, you're going into recession. There is absolutely no question about it, and it will wipe out the revenue growth. So then you're in a situation where not only do you need to fund an extra $1 billion to the pensions, but you don't even have the $700 million in additional state source tax revenue that you thought you were going to have. And several $1 billion of the money that we spend every year out of our general fund's budget comes from federal matching dollars. And as part of the sequester, we could lose federal matching dollars. And if we do that, then that number maybe gets closer to $1 billion that we don't have. So now you're $2 billion in the hole. So this is a very, very serious situation that we face with our budget. Now, let's assume that all goes well, and we make it through fiscal year 14 as expected, only $300 billion behind the 8 ball. Now, at the end of fiscal year 14, what's going to happen January 1st of calendar year 15 is the current tax increases are set to expire. And so the top tax rate, or the tax rate for individuals, goes from 5% to 3.75%, and the corporate tax rate goes from 7% to 5.25%. Okay? On a tax year basis, that's going to cost the state of Illinois about $4 billion. Okay? Now, there are going to be some people that will remind me correctly that when you reduce taxes, you increase economic growth. That's correct. You're not going to increase economic growth enough to offset $4 billion in lost tax revenue. Absolutely impossible. The math doesn't work. So we have to ask ourselves, where is this actually going to take us? Now, if we go off our revenue cliff and I then smooth out revenue growth and say, what's the average growth rate in revenues between now and, say, 2045, which is the end of this 95 funding plan ran. Average revenue growth is 1% a year. How fast do the pensions grow? Pensions are expected to grow, if I smooth the annual increase in pensions, about 4.5% a year. That's what the pension payment's going to grow between now and 2045. Fine. A lot of people will tell me at that point, well, all you need to do is not let that tax increase expire, and you'll probably be okay, right? Wrong again. What's going to happen then is the taxes will increase, instead of on an average rate of 1% a year, about 2.3% a year. So I still have pension payments that are growing at a faster rate than my revenues, which means I'm crowding out spending elsewhere in the budget. All the meanwhile, still facing extraordinary pressure on the healthcare side at probably 5% a year. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to contain also. So where does that leave us? What is the administration's position on how to fix this? Well, number one, we think that the pension systems need to be strengthened and stabilized, and part of that is getting on a actuarial science-based funding schedule. And that means closing the amortization period at 30 years and getting to 100% funding. Something that I hear constantly is I will hear people quote to me a study by the Pew Center for the States that says that an adequate funding level is 80%. And my response generally is only if you don't understand the time value of money. Because an adequate funding level is actually 100%. If I want to pay somebody $1 in an annuity 30 years from now, and based on the expected rate of return to pay that $1, I need to have a nickel in the plan today, well, that means I have 100% funding if I have the nickel in the plan. So when we say we're going to get to 100% funded, that doesn't mean that I'm going to accumulate the $360 billion I'm going to need to pay every annuity payment to every employee in every state system from now until the end of time. What I mean is I've got all those nickels in place. And I had a conversation, I've had various conversations with people at the pension systems, and we've basically got about 50 cents on the dollar right now to pay people that are already retired. I'm not even talking about the people that are still working. So that's a big, big, big problem. We need to get to 100% funded. Secondly, we agree that the compensation decisions need to be aligned with the responsibility to pay for those compensation decisions. And this is, in economist speak, we're correcting a negative externality. We see it as there are incentives in place, for better or for worse, that currently exist to pay at the end of careers more than would be paid otherwise because the pension cost can be externalized to the state. Districts have made this case for us. I read not too long ago in the paper from Elmhurst about a contract that was negotiated where the 6% salary increases, which is the maximum under current statute, were in place for end of career. Unless the cost shift goes into place and they internalize that externality, well, then we're going to reopen the contract, which essentially made our case for us. That the tax price that the community is willing and able to pay has been distorted by the ability to externalize cost. And so what we'd like to do is to align the incentives. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can do this. We understand state still owns the formula, right? So you own the pay, the districts own the pay, state owns the formula. So we need to work together to not only come up with something where the incentives are shared in an equitable fashion, but also in work with Brent. We've talked a lot about how to build this ramp to where it's affordable and to where it doesn't break the school district's budgets also, because that's not at all our intent. Our intent is to properly align the economic incentives over a correct period of time. Thirdly, we want to make sure that the pension payments are a proportional share of the state's resources. So we don't want those pension payments to grow faster than the available revenues to make the payments. Otherwise, again, we have continual crowding out of our ability to do things like fund public safety and fund education. We don't want to see that happen. Fourthly, we believe that any of these reforms that are made have to be constitutional. And by constitutional, we believe that that offer and acceptance framework has to be in place. Now, there are some folks out there that will say, you know, the benefits are already impaired. Every time that the state didn't make that ARC payment that actuarially required a contribution, you've impaired the benefits by definition, and therefore all you're doing is you're going out there and fixing the impairment if you unilaterally do something. And our position is we don't necessarily agree with that because we're not talking about impairment of benefit, we're talking about diminishment. And what's going to happen is there needs to be a contractual offer and acceptance between the individual and the state and the pension systems, because it's not a group benefit, it's not a benefit that the teachers union owns, it's not a benefit that AFSCME owns, it's a benefit that that teacher owns, it's a benefit that that state worker owns. And so the offer and acceptance is between the individual and the state. In fact, there are many workers that are on these pensions, like myself, that are going to be eligible for a state pension. I'm not an AFSCME member. I don't want AFSCME at the table representing me with respect to whether or not I ought to get a certain deal. And I'm imagining that most other management people will feel the same way. So this is not theirs to decide. Do we want them at the table as part of the discussion? Yes, absolutely. Do we want the teachers union at the table as part of the discussion? Absolutely. We want to work with everybody who has some kind of skin in this game, but at the same time, the actual contractual relationship is with the individual. Okay, so we think that that's extremely important. And the final part of this is we want to fix Tier 2, and I think that everybody in this room who understands the tier 2 pension, it's not as generous as probably we'd like it to be. I think that you know, the way that it was redone in the previous legislation we had the right idea, but we think that this cash balance plan will offer not only a better benefit, but it will give the districts and the universities some ability to enhance those benefits to attract talent as they need to. Now, one thing we have had some feedback from the system, from the university system in particular, on the cash balance plan, that the way that the current legislation is constructed may compromise the tax qualified status of the plan, and so we're working with them to come up with some language to where the districts or the universities could, you know, place non-qualified plans on top of their tax qualified plans. But there's ways to work around these sorts of technical problems within legislation. They have a package that works for everybody and is consistent with the Internal Revenue Code. So we're not all that worried about that. One last thing I'm going to wrap up on, and that's some numbers on how we got here. Okay. Number one, we got here because the employer didn't contribute to the plan. If we look at the numbers from, and I did some quick math from 2002 to 2010, because some data I had easily available. We had normal cost plus interest, $21 billion. Making lower than the actuarially required contributions to the pension funds since 2000 has cost $21 billion to the system. That's part of the $57 billion increase in unfunded liability that period, okay? Another $18.7 billion because the actual return on investments in these pension funds did not meet the expected rate of return that was set by the plans. And of course, you're all aware that the teachers' retirement system has recommended to their board a reduction in the expected rate of return for the system. Changes in actuarial assumptions, things like mortality assumptions, have cost $10.6 billion to the system. Benefit increase is another $2.5 billion. Other actuarial shortfalls, $8.4 billion. And so all of these cumulative effects have worked against us. But here's the point. If the state had made the actuarially required contribution every single year, all that other stuff doesn't matter. The investment rate of return doesn't matter. The actuarial changes don't matter. The benefit increases don't matter. Why? Because each year when they value the plan, they would recalculate the actuarial calculation for the next year's contribution, and the whole schedule would be modified to make up those shortfalls. And so every year you're recalculating, you're modifying, and you're changing, and you're re-amortizing, and making sure that you're making the right payment given what all the experience is. And that's what we haven't been doing. We haven't been letting actuarial science work since the day that these plans were conceived, and we need to start doing that. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time. We will open this up for questions. Yes, sir.
Actually, this is the first time I've heard an explanation from a state official that acknowledges the fact I'm both a retired teacher and a school board member, so I have double skin in the game, so to speak. First person I've heard actually admit that this is a state problem that goes back a number of years. And the first time I've actually almost agreed with your position to shift the cost of the school district. Unfortunately, you're allowing people like the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago and the Illinois Policy Institute to speak for you, and their attitude is much less reasonable than yours. For example, the State Journal Register, which I think is a clone of the Tribune, yesterday, the former Attorney General argued that you need to pick up the cost and just negotiate lower salaries with your teachers. maybe if he wants to come down and negotiate with our teachers, he's welcome to do that. So I'm going to say, I hope that some of your message gets out in a more positive way than we've seen in both upstate and downstate publications.
Thank you. Question? Yes.
You brought up how you were going to shift costs to the districts and nobody addressed that. I thought someone was going to talk about how you were going to do that. How is the question?
I'll take a stab and then certainly hand it off to whoever. Again, and I will overgeneralize and let these guys clean up my mess. Generally, the philosophy behind it first, when we were first brought in to meet with President Cullerton and Speaker Madigan, and their point was, these are your employees, school districts. You should be responsible for their share of the pensions. So generally, what happened was they wanted to shift what they called the normal cost of the pension system to the school district. It's not the entire cost. The normal cost excludes all that old unfunded liability because the state didn't pay their bills. And generally, the normal costs are what it will take to provide the pension benefits for the people you employ right now and into the future. And at the time they said that would be around, and again this number floated a little bit, but around 8 to 9% of your TRS payroll. And the first meeting, and Dr. Clark remembers us well when we were in there, when we asked, well, how in the world can a school district put up 9% of your TRS payroll at once? Can we phase it in? And Speaker Madigan did.
He has this gesture he does, but it effectively means you do it now. And I won't show exactly what the gesture is, but just kind of you get the sense he's serious. Okay?
But generally, everything up front in year one, a shift. Obviously devastating to school districts. Since then, they started looking at a slower phase in. And again, nothing was ever set in stone to see. But generally, as Dr. Clark had talked about earlier, it would be something like 1% or 0.5% of your TRS payroll per year until all of that, all of those normal costs are covered by the school district and not by the state. Now where that ends, nobody knows because it all hinges on the option that was brought up. Nobody knows how many people are going to give up the COLA to keep their salary increases and their insurance. So depending on how many people take that option, that's going to determine how much the unfunded liability increases and therefore how much you have to pay. So nobody really knows where that would stop. But if it was phased in, it would be probably either 1% or 0.5%, whatever they decide on, per year, each year into the future until all those normal costs are absorbed by the local school district. Is that close?
Yeah. I'll just stand up here for a minute. Yeah, I think that's a fair representation of it. I just want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to be very clear that Ty Fainer and the Commercial Club do not speak for the Quinn administration or the General Assembly.
Or the IESA.
Yeah, or I think anybody up here, at least certainly us three who have said that. But so just want to place that on the table. As far as the cost shift goes, the way that we envision the phase-in is exactly what has been explained. Something between 0.5%, maybe 0.6% of payroll per year. If you visualize, and Brent and I had this conversation a few times where we had our Cartesian graph, right?
That's right.
And we start with a line up at around 8 to 9%, which is what the percent of payroll is right now that's being paid by the state. And that amount will kind of go up for a couple of years and then start coming down as more and more Tier 2 people enter the system. And so the normal cost for the group is declining over time. Now, eventually, under the Tier 2 system, normal cost, the employer's share of it actually goes negative in the long run of the current system. That's kind of one of the problems with Tier 2, is that the people that will be in the system at that time will actually be paying more for their benefit than it is worth. So under the current construct in the long run, there's absolutely no risk to the districts. The risk to the district is that we actually want to fix that. And so the long run normal cost under what we've talked about is about 3% of payroll on the cash balance plan. And so the question is what's the slope of the line between the 8% and the 3% long run rate of equilibrium? And it's, you know, kind of a this shape sort of a thing. And your obligation would be ramping up underneath that line at about 0.5% of payroll per year until the contribution lines intersect, at which point you would own the entire normal cost. Now, is that open to further discussion? Sure, but that's what we're currently suggesting. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Let me explain this and take his Cartesian chart and simplify that a little bit. What's happening is when you have employer normal costs are like 8 to 9% now. So over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see them start to ease up. But then out somewhere around 4 or 5 years from now, we're going to start to see them slope down. Okay? So this intersection, 11 or 12 years out, between these employer normal costs starting to come down and where this gradual shift, employer picking up the cost, intersects, should be about 11 or 12 years down the road. As long as the assumed interest rate that TRS uses in their 5-year study doesn't get too far off of where it is today. Right now it's at 8%. 6 months ago it was at 8.5%. So as long as it doesn't vary too much, then about 11 or 12 years is where those lines should cross. Also, as long as the benefits aren't enhanced, which I don't think we have a chance of enhancing retirement benefits in the near future. So as long as benefits aren't enhanced, that won't drive up the normal cost, but that could. So if benefits get enhanced for some weird reason, that could drive up the employer normal cost. And also, if the mortality tables that your pension system uses to calculate the employer normal cost, if those happen to be off in terms of how long people are going to live, or in other words, when they're going to die, if those happen to be wrong, then that changes the employer normal cost. So there's some unbelievable variables in terms of, this is a calculus, it's an algorithm problem. And you have, you know, a range of solutions out here, a range of time when you're going to cross those numbers. So here's all of that in simple form, okay? Because your eyes are like, good God, what did you just say? So here's what it is. Think about 4 buckets of money. And those 4 buckets of money added up together over time equals a person's kind of individual retirement account inside the big pension system. Bucket number 1 is contributed by the state. That's what we call the employer normal cost. That's the state bucket. The second bucket is contributed by the district, and that's about 0.58%. So bucket number 2, 0.85% or 0.58% currently contributed by the district. The third bucket is the employee contribution. Some employees pay that 9.4% for themselves. Some have bargained it that the district pays the third bucket, the 9.4%. Then the fourth bucket is the interest earned over time of a person's career of all 3 buckets' money added up, invested, and earned interest over time equals this amount of money that's kind of set aside for this individual's retirement. So what we're talking about here in cost shift is taking bucket 1, the state wants to take bucket 1 and gradually move it into bucket 2 so that in the future there is no bucket 1, there's no state contribution, and bucket 2 gets a lot bigger. It goes from 0.58 to whatever it grows to over time. So that's the kind of math we're looking at. That's a simple version of the Cartesian charts and the graphs that Hans and I like to talk about. So, algorithms.
I don't speak Cartesian, so I really lost a lot of that. Did that answer? No. Okay. No?
I have a good question. I think from all of our perspective, from school board members, we know what the cost has been shifting. Given what everything that Hans talked about on the budget issues that the state faces, it's coming. Right? It's coming local. And Hans, you hit the nail on the head when you said, if we're going to get the cost, we want some say in the money. Not only do we want some say in the money, but we want some say that the money is going to be spent where it should be spent. I will remind you, Representative Nicholas, that The city of Chicago, yes, they bill the taxpayers. The city's never made that contribution.
Yes, back.
You know, and I respect the dilemma that your group is facing, and I understand the state of Illinois. And if this was the only hit that school districts were taking, then we might go back to our districts and we might say, look, this is our state, we gotta help them out. But it's not. We have not received state aid payments. We are mandated to do things that there is no money for. Tell me in all your mathematical calculations, how do you calculate for when the schools are completely broke and cannot pay the bill? How do we do that?
But point was well taken. That is pretty much exactly what we said in that first meeting was, you know, if this was in a vacuum, it's the first thing that happened, you can talk about it, but it is not. And it's going into the, certainly third, going into the fourth year of cuts from the state budget. We're generally at 2008 funding levels. Absolutely.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.